Hello and welcome. My name is Eric Francis Coppolino, and I am here with the video for the class It's All in the Houses. This is the visual portion, so I can basically relate to you certain concepts that depend upon kind of a demonstrative visual presentation. And also, in case anyone might be interested in taking the class, I figured you might watch this video because this video is merely preparation for the class. The class actually gets into what the houses are actually about and how actually to use them in different charts. Now, the expression "it's all in the houses" comes from Patrick Walker. Patrick was probably the greatest horoscope writer who ever worked in the business, and he made that statement to Jonathan Caner, who passed it on to me, and so I can pass it on to you. And the reason why it stuck with me is, first of all, that Patrick is the person who, in effect, taught me astrology by demonstrating that it was possible, by demonstrating that something hair all over the place. Where's that one? I'm in this mirror image, non-mirror image. By demonstrating that it's possible. Fritz Perls, the inventor of Gestalt therapy, said, learning is discovering that something is possible. And so it was through Patrick and his horoscope column in the New York Post that I discovered astrology was possible, that it could be done, that it could have relevance, that it could be beautiful, that it could be expressed. And through studying the Patrick Walker horoscope for a couple of years, I basically learned astrology, and I learned more astrology from reading the New York Post horoscope consciously, studiously, with a pencil and a notebook, than I learned from all of those books combined. And the thing is that when someone demonstrates something, that is a potent testimony. So when Patrick says it's all in the houses, I knew exactly what he meant. This class is designed to help people who have been studying for a long time, who've been reading books and taking classes and perhaps reading the charts of people that you know, but you're not certain that you're actually getting the message of the chart, that you're able to assemble the pieces and make the chart speak as a cohesive whole. And generally, the first thing to check is the astrology student or astrologer's knowledge of the houses and the use of the houses and the way that they put them to work. All right, so there's a lot of controversy in the astrological field about house systems and which house system is better, and this has only become more complicated since the introduction of whole sign houses in the late 1990s. Now, whole sign houses is an old method dating back to the classical era, but it wasn't really known to anyone but horoscope writers until Rob Hand put out his monograph, Whole Sign Houses, which explained the house system and why it's so useful. Astrologers have used lots of other house systems, but not whole sign houses. Now, the reason why newspaper horoscope writers such as Patrick or Jonathan or myself need to use whole sign houses is that we don't know your birth time, or your birth date, or your birth year. We're just doing astrology for people that's not even supposed to work, but somehow when it's done well, it does work. So this is why I'm keen on listening to the people who can do this kind of odd, interesting, and beautiful thing. And the way Patrick organized his interpretations was the houses. So I want to talk about what a house is. All right. A house represents three things mainly, and it's important to keep all three things in mind. The first thing that a house represents, there, peeking out from behind this thing, is a confluence of themes, okay? Not a group of themes, a confluence, because the themes are all related. They flow into one another. Fluid is the root of the word confluence. They flow, they stream from one idea to another. And when you see the relationship between all the different themes in a house, you understand what that house is really about. The second thing that a house represents is a physical location. Houses are environments that can be identified and occupied. You know when you're sitting in one. Right now, I'm sitting in my workspace, and that is the sixth house. And the third thing is that houses all describe relationships between people. They describe relationships that are appropriate to that aspect of life. Okay? So what the old astrology books would say is that a house represents a department of life, which in a sense is true. The sixth house usually represents the department of work and of service. But there's many themes that are part of the sixth house. And the simplest way to say that is work and service, but there's going to be a lot of occasions when you're reading charts that something more than just work or service. For example, there's the theme of healing. There is the theme of the passage of time going very quickly. When you get lost in your work and you start a project and then you look up and 3 hours have gone by, that's an attribute of the sixth house. And so what all those have in mind is involvement and service, dedication, devotion, and applying your mind. Okay, so remember, 3 things, and this is the basis of this class. Houses represent a confluence of themes, a physical location, and relationships between people. And when you know something about each of those things for a house, you understand the house, and then you have a way of growing what else you put into that house, because themes always come up. Things are always invented. When these systems of house organization were invented, there was no such thing as airmail. There was no such thing as the telegraph. There was no such thing as a car. And so as time and technology and civilization and society march on, we have to fit them into one of these 12 general categories of life. Now, first, a brief note about the relationship between a sign and a house. In the 1970s, there was a popular method of explaining to astrology to make it over simple and perpetuate some misunderstandings that said that everything about Aries equals the first house, and everything about Taurus equals the second house, and everything about Gemini equals the third house. You may have been trained in this way, and I will concede that there's a relationship between the first house and the first sign, as there's a relationship between the 8th house and Scorpio and the 9th house and Sagittarius. But the relationship is not absolute. And when you're working with both houses and signs, it's important to remember that the house represents the place on Earth where and when the thing that we're talking about happens, and that the planets that the sign associated with that house and the planets in it represents a style of expression. Okay, so let's say, to give an example, jumping ahead a little bit, but you probably will follow me, the 10th house represents your career, no matter what. But if you have Capricorn on the 10th house, you're more likely to have an interest in a business career. If you have Pisces on the 10th house, you're more likely to have an interest in an artistic or spiritual career. So no matter what, the 10th house represents your career, your major goals. But the sign involved on that house, and I'll show you how they relate in a second. That's most of what this video is about. The sign involved is the style. I'll give another example. Let's say someone has third house in their chart and Gemini is on the third house. That's a method of communication that would be more suited to talking. If they have Aquarius on the third house, it might be more suited to writing computer code. So we identify the basic activity and the location the thing being done and where it's being done is the house. So third house, local and communication. But what form of communication is another story. If Cancer's on the third house, it might be a more empathic, emotional communication. If, let's say, Virgo is on the third house, the person might have more of an interest in books. And so a lot of the power that we get from astrology is combining the sign and the house, and then making up an additional story. So I'm going to get to that. I've got some demonstration charts to show you how we make these organizations. And then the third layer are the planets, where they fall and how they interweave around the chart. And then there you basically have a chart. So what I'm giving you is a syntax system, an order of operations, a way to start, a way to get into the chart and at least ask the first question in a way that is comprehensible to you and that makes sense and that will yield some kind of information or an answer that will be useful to you in a practical way. There's two really important things to remember about astrology. One thing is that it's a practical art. It's got a use. It's not art for art's sake. Astrology is a pragmatic thing, like a car. Now, a car can be beautiful, it can be clean, it can be messy, it can be well engineered or poorly engineered, but ultimately the purpose of a car is to get you from one place to another. And the purpose of astrology is to get your mind from one place to another. As Steve Jobs said of the computer, it's like a bicycle for the mind. And I would say that more than being like a car for the mind, astrology is a bit like a bicycle for the mind. And the wheel is something that you pedal, you turn the wheel. So let's take a look at a wheel and see the most basic form of a wheel. Remember also that astrology is the most complex divination system. And you need patience to do it, and you need to be able to follow along first. It's a little bit like baseball before you play the game. It helps if you can follow the game and and watch and know what's happening and why it's happening. And then when you have something to say, that's called an interpretation. You can actually come out and say it. So let's look at this scenario here. This is your basic blank wheel. And the lines indicated are the houses. Now, what is somewhat contradictory about using hard, like black lines for the houses is that actually the houses are a bit fuzzy in nature, and there's more of a transition zone between them. And I'm going to cover that in a second. Whereas the signs really do begin and end in a certain place. Now, I realize there's different theories about this. Alice Bailey, for example, talks about the signs being gradient-like. I have not found it to be as true that the signs run in a gradient, like there's a transition zone between Aquarius and Pisces, so much as the houses run in a gradient, and the signs are measurable for where they begin and where they end. And ultimately, this is not about some kind of a hard and fast rule here. We're talking about an interpretive art. And even though I'm about to give you a lot of information that is grounded in technique and, in a sense, in technology, ultimately, the judgment calls of astrology, the things that you say that you got from the chart, are always going to be interpretive, and largely they are going to be intuitive. So you might think, why do all this work if ultimately it's going to come down to your intuition? Well, astrology provides a guidance system that facilitates intuition. It provides you with a structural framework to work with intuition. So here are the houses. There's 12 of them. First house is below this horizontal line. And this horizontal line is, in fact, the horizon in most charts, or a symbol of the horizon. So physically, this line represents the ground that we stand upon. And below the first line is the first house. And that has a group of themes, including self-concept, how you present yourself, who you believe yourself to be, what you call yourself, and to some extent, what you look like. Second house is an extension of that, and the second house is your values, your personal resources, and your self-esteem. Third house, this is communications, and it begins with one's brethren and one's neighbors, and then it expands to one's community, but also includes all the tools of writing and communicating. Fourth house, home base, security, and one of your parents or both of them has a lot to do with family and with the father's side of the family, and represents the physical dwelling that you live in. Fifth house, creativity, art, playful sex, gambling, speculation, children. Sixth house, work and healing, service. Seventh house, partnerships, marriage, open enemies, and open friends. That is to say, those who are known about. Eighth house, the contract that the relationship has. So, for example, the seventh represents marriage, but the eighth represents the marriage contract and the money transacted in marriage. Ninth house, spirituality and long-distance travel, all things exotic. 10th house, one's career, one's ambitions and one's goals, one's relationship to power. 11th house, one's friends, one's organizations. That you might think of it as the group that all people, the group of everyone that you know, and perhaps many of the people that they know. So there's a lot of people by the time you get to the 11th. 12th house is a kind of an alternate dimension of that which has gone missing. It's almost like the dream plane, and it is a kind of a non-physical dimension. But it also represents things like cinema and photography. So it represents things that come with the feeling of or depend upon or utilize illusion in some way. So that is a very quick introduction to what these houses are. But if you'll study that, you'll see there's a story that's told that goes from one house to the next. For example, the first house is oneself, the second house is one's values and one's possessions, and the third house is one's community and one's neighbors and what one has to say, and the fourth house is how one feels and one's home, and does one feel safe and secure. And then you move on to the fifth, where there's creativity and art and play and celebration and sex, and then the sixth is the house of work and effort and service and so forth. There's a gradient. There's a story of transitions told. Now, the thing about the houses is that the first house is always below the horizon no matter what, and the seventh house is always right above the horizon no matter what, and the ninth and 10th are always overhead, and the third and fourth are always basically below our feet. They're down. And what happens is that behind the houses, the signs are moving. So you'll see that every chart there's house cusps for the charts. Well, that's because the sky is moving. So here's what the house cusps look like, and then we're gonna look at a couple of example charts in addition to this one. All right. So here's a chart of the houses, but it has some signs behind it, and this is just a random chart. So here's the first house. They're not always numbered, by the way. First, second, third, fourth, and so forth. Here's the 12th house in this chart. Notice that Sagittarius in this chart takes up a little piece of the first house, all of the 12th house, and a little piece of the 11th house. And that's often true. In the case of Scorpio, it covers a piece of the 11th and a piece of the 10th. Libra covers a piece of the 10th and a piece of the 9th. And these numbers around the outermost wheel tell you where, for example, in this case, the 10th house intersects with Libra. It intersects with Libra at 18 degrees and 41 minutes. That's the address of the 10th house, is 18 Libra 41. The address of the 11th house is 14 Scorpio 39. The address of the 12th house is 5 Sag 32, and so forth. The address of the ascendant or first house is 24 Sag 54. So my point here is that the houses stay put. The houses stay where they are. 10th house, 9th house, always overhead. 3rd and 4th below. 12th and 1st to the east. 7th and 6th to the west. But because the world is turning, the signs are turning behind the houses. So the houses are very much a mundane thing. The houses exist on Earth, and they're represented by oriented on the Earth. The horizon, the meridian, the vertical equivalent of the horizon, and the world turns. And so, because the astrology system is what's called geocentric, it's something done with the world in the middle, with the planet Earth in the middle, and astrology is located on Earth. The sun, for example, rises, culminates, and sets, but it doesn't really rise, culminate, and set. The world is turning. And so imagine the sun being in a sign. Today it's in Libra. So in the morning, the sun's going to be there, and then it's going to rise. Then a little bit later in the morning, it's going to be higher. At noon, it's going to be overhead, and then it's going to be setting, and it's going to take Libra with it. And so as the day goes on, Libra, at the beginning of the astrological day at sunrise, Libra is straddling the 1st and the 12th. And a little bit later in the morning, it's straddling the 11th and the 12th. A little bit later, it's the 10th and the 11th. And at noon, the Libra is straddling the 9th and the 10th. Okay, so we've got this thing of a wheel inside of a wheel. The wheel inside the wheel is the houses, and the wheel outside the wheel is the signs. Okay, how are we doing here? Following along? So I'm going to make sure that these are photographs. You can see them and review them. But again, the main idea of this diagram is to show where houses and signs intersect. And remember that any house and sign, as long as they're followed in order, can intersect. So for example, when I made this chart, the sun was high in the sky. It was around 12:30 or 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And now Libra and the sun are about here. And I reckon we'd be having Aquarius rising right now. So everything is turning. The signs in particular are turning this way. And the houses stay where they are. And things pass through those houses. And that's what makes charts different. And that's what makes astrology so interesting. All right, now I'm going to switch here. I ran out of... we're going to switch the chart of Yoko Ono. Neil Young. We're going to look at Yoko and Neil Young, just to give us a concept of how this works. So I've got a chart for Yoko. And in the case of Yoko, she's Libra rising. In fact, she just had a new moon on her ascendant. Okay, so here's Yoko's chart. Yoko has Libra rising. You can see it right there, which means that the first house cusp intersects Libra. And it intersects Libra at 8 degrees and 30 minutes. And it's pretty simple. And the second house intersects Scorpio at 8 degrees and 5 minutes. And then the third house intersects Sag at 7 and 27. And then the fourth house intersects Capricorn at 9:25, and so forth. And this is Yoko's unique pattern. And one of the things that makes a chart unique is the pattern of where the houses intersect with the signs. And this is a very helpful dimension of astrology because it tells you where to look for information. So I'll give you an example. The houses and the signs are related because they directly intersect. But say, for example, in the case of Leo being on Yoko's 11th house, we look for the ruler of Leo, and that's the sun in Aquarius. So there's a relationship between Leo on the 11th house and the sun in Aquarius. And what part of that says is that the themes of the 11th house, for example, being a publicly known person, being someone with a vast social network as Yoko has and so forth, are going to be expressed here with the sun, the ruler of Leo, in the fifth house in Aquarius. She's an artist, plain and simple. The fifth house is the house of art. So there's an example of one very simple interpretation of how you connect a person and why these houses are so important. Yoko is not the stay-at-home kind of artist. She never was. Yoko is the kind of artist who wants to put her stuff out in public and be known for her art, plain and simple. And that is, and plus she doesn't really care about being, well, let's just stick to the 11th. Known in the style of House 11, known socially, known as she's kind of a social activist around her art, right? But we see that confirmed that she is in fact an artist with the sun in Aquarius, and notably it is in the very last degree of Aquarius. So this is just one example of putting together the houses, the signs that are behind the houses that align with them, and then a planet that's associated with one of those signs. And when you have a question in astrology, you need to isolate the question, or when you're reading by house, and when you are reading the natal chart of a person, you're going to do this maneuver over and over again by ascertaining what house and sign a planet is associated with. And typically, it will be associated with more than one house. For example, because she's got Leo up here, well, her sun is connected to Leo because the sun rules Leo, but the sun is in the fifth house because that just happens to be where it is. She's born at 8:30 at night. The sun set, kept going over Tokyo, and a few hours, 3 hours or so after sunset, the sun was down below the horizon. It kept on going as the world turned and then rose again in the morning. All right, let's take another look at Yoko Ono's chart. Only let's add a few more planets to it so we can see what it looks like when you populate the chart a little bit. So same chart, there's the sun at 29-23 of Aquarius in the fifth. But now we see there's other planets. There's a group of planets in the 12th house. And Virgo is on the 12th house cusp. And anything in early Virgo is going to be leaning toward the 11th, and anything toward mid to late Virgo is going to be leaning toward the 12th here. Now remember that there's not a strict line. There's no line for where the sign is, but that would be more appropriate for the house. But astrology illustrates it the other way, where the house gets the defined line written in ink, and the sign is just back there somewhere. You know what sign things are in because you can see it written. 9 Virgo 6 is Neptune, 15 Virgo 8 is Mars, and so forth. So the address of the planet in the sign is given there. The address of the house cusp is given there. And then the 12th is always in the east, right above the horizon. All right, let's take a look at the pattern for Neil Young. Same basic idea. That every person has a unique configuration of where the houses and the signs overlay. So Neil Young is Aquarius rising. So he has Aquarius on his first house cusp. So Aquarius takes part of his 12th and part of his first. Now what's so interesting, or one interesting thing about Neil Young's chart, is you see how the 11th has Capricorn on it, and the 12th and the 11th has Sag, and the 10th has Sag. Sag is on 2 houses. The 9th has Scorpio, and so forth. But Pisces doesn't get a house cusp. And that's called an interception. And the way that an interception is written properly and they always come in oppositions, is like that. You make those brackets to indicate that Pisces is kind of floating in the first house. So the first house of Neil Young's chart covers part of Aquarius, all of Pisces, and part of Aries. And why is that? Well, it's with the different house systems that divide the houses differently. Now, one thing about the house systems that is worth knowing, and it's partly why this controversy is somewhat overblown, I think, is, let's find a ruler. What houses are dividing is the distance between one of the horizon lines and one of the meridian lines. So, for example, in all house systems, Neil Young's chart is going to have 4 Sag 6 rising, on the midheaven, and then 12 Aquarius 41 on the first house. And when we talk about a house system, all it's really dividing is the space between the two. What's the formula for doing that? So, for example, in Neil Young's chart, cast in Placidus houses. Placidus houses, a moderately old house system. The interception comes out in Pisces. Pisces doesn't get a house cusp. But if we change the house system to Koch houses, a newer house system developed in the 1970s, and it happens to be the one that I prefer, being a modern guy, you can see that instead of Pisces being intercepted in the first house, hold on a second here. In this chart, Pisces is intercepted in the first house using Placidus houses. But if we switch to Koch houses, Aries now is the intercepted sign in the second, and Libra is intercepted in the eighth. So changing house systems often will move the interception. Now, interceptions are a little tricky to read. That's sort of like the second degree of reading houses. Almost every chart has an interception. But what I've never heard an astrologer say in this whole house system fracas that's been going on since long before anybody ever remembers cracking open an astrology textbook is that where the interception lands gives you a clue what the right house system is for you. In other words, the interceptions can be interpreted, and maybe Yoko has Pisces intercepted in the first house, or maybe she has Aries intercepted in the second house. We need to know Yoko a little bit better to do that, but you have, very likely, if you cast your chart, your natal chart, in a few different house systems, you will see that the interception moves. And the question of what house system is correct is helped be not so abstract by looking at where that interception is. And there's a technique for reading interceptions I learned from Martha Westcott. It's really not appropriate for the class that we're doing today, but it's a very helpful technique. And if we have some time on Saturday, when we do the class on Saturday the 8th, I'll offer some ideas about that. So let's recap. I think I've covered most of the basics, and really what I'm looking to cover in this class is the anatomy of physically, structurally, what a house is, and then conceptually what a house is. Let's just review the first 3 slides in my PowerPoint presentation made with printer paper and artist tape. House represents a confluence of themes, not a group, a confluence. And when you see the relationship between the different themes, you understand what that house is about. 3, a physical location. When you can identify the physical location of a house, or when you can say to yourself, what house am I in right now? Where am I physically? That is indication that you understand what a house is about. And then the third house is a relationship between, third concept is relationship between people. Let's give a couple of examples of that, since I didn't give that as an example that I moved through, and then we'll end on that note. First house is your relationship to yourself, and the second house is more of an extension of yourself to like a relationship between you, how you feel about yourself, and your stuff. Do you value your possessions or do you not? So the second house views your physical environment and your possessions in your environment as an extension of yourself. The third house has as a relationship your neighbors, your brothers and sisters, and the people that you correspond with. So those are the people of the third house, your sibs, your neighbors, and your correspondents. The fourth house is more the people who you actually dwell with and live with in your physical address, in your physical home. All right. Fifth house is people who you might say it's the group of very select friends that you would let into your art studio. The people you might collaborate with artistically also. Sixth house is the people that you work with, your coworkers, and also your clients, people who wind up on your healing table, or your healer, the person on whose healing table you wind up on. Seventh house is open friends and open enemies and marriage partners. Eighth house is the people behind the marriage relationship with whom you have some financial relationship, such as in-laws, father, grandfather, the people who provide the dowry. The eighth is about death and dowry. So the relationships of the eighth house are, for example, your heirs, or the people from whom you inherit money, and then by extension of that, the in-laws with whom you are legally bonded due to the marriage contract or the will. Ninth house represents, for example, spiritual teachers and guides. It represents the priest. It represents perhaps the sea captain who takes you on a long voyage. Now, if you can make the connection between the sea captain and the priest, you're starting to understand the ninth house. But they're both a certain type of authority figure. Okay. 10th house, relationships in the 10th are bosses, other people in power. If you're a politician, other politicians, the government, your parents. 10th house. 11th house, your friends, your group. 12th house, everyone who's gone missing or gone crazy in your life. Okay, that's a little summary of who. I will have some notes for you for this, and there are also a number of resources. Excuse me, I'm a little itchy here. A number of resources available. There's a resource on Planet Waves called "It's All About the Houses." We'll link it from the bottom of this video. Now, this is not the kind of subject matter that you can just get like super simple. You know, you plug it in and it works. It takes years of experience to get the feeling for the houses. The good part about that is you have a lot of lead time. You're not just coming into this from scratch. And the reason I say that is, even if you're a relatively new astrology student, is that astrology represents what is already there. You're not studying anything other than the world through a certain system of organization that astrology presents. Right? So you've been doing a lot of this categorization before, and astrology is just basically giving you a kind of a shorthand system to group things together and then study the relationship between the things in those groups. All right, so take careful notes, be patient, save your questions for Saturday or for the email group that follows, or if you're watching this video far, far in the future, write to me at, efc@ericfrancis.com. Thanks for being a student and supporter of Planet Waves, and I will see you soon. All right, bye for now.